Josh Pate said something on one of his most recent shows that has to do with the ACC, conference realignment, ESPN, and I think a lot of people missed it, which they shouldn't have, but they did anyway. Now listen, I've heard from several of you. I know that some of you are not massive fans of Josh Pate, which is fine. You don't have to be. I like a lot of the stuff that he does, and at the end of the day, different strokes for different folks. But no matter your thoughts about him or his show or just his thoughts on FSU, doesn't matter. What he said was still really important. He had some conference realignment thoughts that I thought were pretty surprising to hear from someone in his position. In fact, he's one of the first with his platform to be able to take this stand and say something this bold. Let me play the clip for you and then we'll talk about it.
Just remember this. I said this a month ago vaguely, and I'm going to say it again vaguely. ESPN does not hold some of the cards here. ESPN holds all of the cards because it is ESPN with which they have that deal as a conference, that grant of rights deal. That's who they're locked in with. And I can assure you, and they know what I'm about to say is true. They know there are certain key dates in the not too distant future where if ESPN really wanted to, they could pull one lever and that thing dissolves. And you know what happens if they pull that lever? Not only is Florida State free to go wherever they want to, but so is Virginia Tech, North Carolina. The ACC kind of dissolves, or at least it's up in the air. It's in a state of flux. And all of a sudden, the prison doors just open. And everyone, is this a psyop? Is this a test? And Florida State says, don't care. Woo! And they just run down the hallway and they're out. So
basically, he says ESPN could pull just one lever and the entire thing would essentially just be done. Now, look, I want to reiterate this. I do not care if you like Josh Pate or not. I know this. He's very well connected. I know his info behind the scenes is typically right. And most importantly, I know that he's very guarded with his words. And he tries his best to not present things that could be wrong, misleading, or just incorrect. Unless we're talking about Mario Cristobal, which for some reason he's willing to be wrong there all the time. But that's another story for another day. What I think Pate meant by this, and I broke it down further on our national channel, which I'll link above right now and at the end of the video, but it's the fact that ESPN's deal with the ACC only going through the 2026 season is a huge issue for the conference. There are basically two schools of thought here. Number one is that ESPN has an absolute sweetheart deal with the ACC, and since Disney has their own financial issues at this time, they wouldn't want to end what they have going with the Atlantic Coast Conference. There may be some validity to that if Florida State, Clemson, UNC, and others were in a happy position and not a position of volatility or looking to leave. The second train of thought, and this is more of where I lie, says that ESPN knows where this is headed and would not want to get caught with their pants down in this situation. I've been told by a couple of sources that Florida State is gone, one way or another. They could literally go to court and lose on every single complaint that they have with the ACC. And the ACC could win on every single complaint that they have against Florida State. And if that happens, Florida State will just pay the money and go. They'll just use the private equity. Those conversations are not just happening for fun. They are gone either way. Now, the court case is important because if you can lower some of those hundreds of millions of dollars down to a much smaller or more reasonable penalty, say you can get the liquidated damages part to be gone, and then you just owe the $100 to $20 million or so exit fee, then I think you're pretty happy. If you could end up paying around that and not any of the rights, I think Florida State would do that in a heartbeat. And it certainly would be worth it to have gone to court. But it doesn't matter. Florida State knows those numbers and they know those figures so well of what it's going to cost over that length of time, over that period, because they've already asked for it from those private equity companies. And they are going to get out of this conference one way or the other. And so if you're ESPN, do you continue on with an ACC that doesn't have Florida State in it, that doesn't end up having Clemson in it, that doesn't end up having North Carolina in it, that probably doesn't have Miami in it? Is the ACC a worthwhile product to you? Well, we found out that the Pac-12 wasn't. And is the Pac-12 with Utah and Colorado and some of these other teams, is that just about as valuable as the ACC without its big four teams? I'd say so. It's not the Southeast. There's less viewers, less people that care, but I'd say it's a similar product. Back to Pate. He knows, and I assume that he's even aware that ESPN knows that the ACC is very much in trouble. You can think or say what you want about these lawsuits, but ESPN isn't stupid. As much as we like to hate on them, they know when to get up and walk away from the table. But I'll bet you anything that you want, there is no chance that the ESPN powers that be are going to extend their agreement with the ACC if, number one, Florida State and others are not part of the conference, and number two, if this uncertainty is still up in the air. But what Pate confirmed is much more about what Florida State is actually arguing against the ACC right now. ESPN can unilaterally cancel the agreement and this whole thing is over. That's part of what FSU's complaint is. The agreement that we're tied to goes for 10 years longer than the actual media rights agreement that the conference and ESPN have together. Talk about instability. Talk about uncertainty. This is why FSU and Josh Pate and others know that the wheels are turning now. Now, where does all this go? I tend to think like Doug Rohan, who we've had on several times on this issue and will continue to get on. We appreciate Doug and Rohan Law for all that they do to support us, but I think that this ends up getting settled and FSU pays a small or relatively small price to get out. But there's something else that a lot of other folks are missing. Florida State leaving the conference is not dependent on any sort of litigation. I'll repeat that and maybe say it from a little bit different angle. FSU getting out of the ACC doesn't depend on these complaints that Florida State and the ACC have filed against each other. It doesn't, no lawsuit matters. No breach of contract matters. No judge's final decision matters. Whether this stays in local court or goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, none of that matters for Florida State leaving the conference. And that's one thing that I think people are missing in a major way. Leaving the conference is happening one way or the other. I will be shocked if there's not an announcement made before August 15th, the deadline for the Noles to leave the conference. I'll be mystified by that if we don't announce. The lawsuits and the complaint only have to do with how much money we end up having to pay the ACC. But leaving the conference is a foregone conclusion. I'm at about 95% that we don't play the 2025 schedule against the ACC. I went into very much full detail on this in my latest video on our national channel, College Football Addiction, and even included details on why Florida State might be forced to try and leave before this 2024 season. Now, I won't clickbait you so hard. I think the chances of that are relatively small, but I still think the chances of that do exist. If you want to check out my thoughts there of why Florida State's lawsuits and leaving the ACC don't really mean anything together, they're very separate issues, as well as why Florida State may try to look to get out even faster, you can do so by clicking on the video on the screen right now. And make sure to subscribe to that new channel. I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Go Noles.